Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo developer evangelist. And our topic this time is a brief overview of desktop apps that you can make with Xojo. So a little bit of background about desktop apps. Desktop apps are actually the first type of app that Xojo could make way back when it first came out in 1998. It actually started with the ability to make Mac desktop apps, and over time added Windows, Linux, and Raspberry Pi, of course. Xojo apps are native, so they're actually compiled to machine code. They run natively on the computer, not a shared UI interface or anything like that. And as I mentioned, Xojo can make desktop apps that run on Windows, Mac, Linux, and Raspberry Pi. And Xojo also can build 32-bit and 64-bit apps, which is handy depending on the operating systems you're using. In the case of Mac, you're pretty much going to want everything to be 64-bit these days. Windows and Linux vary a bit depending on the version. I think most Linux distributions are probably 64-bit these days, but it's possible you might have a 32-bit one lying around for a lower memory device, perhaps. The same with Windows. 64-bit is pretty common, but some lower spec devices are running 32-bit versions of Windows. But regardless, Xojo has you covered on all of those things. And Raspberry Pi currently is, although the hardware is 64-bit, the operating system, Raspbian, is 32-bit only at this point. So you build 32-bit apps for Raspberry Pi. So let me just give you a brief overview of some of the project items that are available in Xojo desktop projects. So the general items here are the ones that are available for all project types. So Xojo makes desktop apps, of course, but it can also do web and iOS apps and console apps. And these items here are available in all of those. So class, of course, class interface, you can add a folder, image, and module. So these are all general project items that you can add that are useful for creating your apps, doing organization, that sort of thing. And then desktop-specific project items are container control, file type set, menu bar, report, toolbar, and window, probably one of the commonly used ones. So these are only available in desktop projects, and obviously they aren't going to really make much sense outside of a desktop project. So those are the specific ones. So actually, if you were working on some app that wanted to have multiple targets, say be desktop and web, if you stuck to the general items, you can actually share that things that are in that for code or images or whatnot across your projects. And it doesn't make sense to share the UI specific stuff, but you can share quite a bit of code if you stick with the general items for multiple projects. So a bit about the build settings that are available for your desktop apps. You click on the app in the library, you'll see that you've got options to specify the default window that opens when the app starts, the default menu bar, and its app icon. There's also shared build settings that kind of apply to the app as a whole. And this provides version information and build information, all important stuff. You can control the type of optimization that is used when you're building for 64-bit or ARM. And you can also enable high DPI and dark mode support. There's also some debug settings in there. And then for each particular operating system target, they have their own build settings. So all of them will let you specify the app name, of course, and whether you are building the app as 32-bit or 64-bit. And depending on the operating system, there may or may not be other settings in there. We'll click through and look at some of this stuff when we get to our demo, which is now. So here I have Xojo, and I should select desktop. And we're just going to be looking around the IDE here. I'm not really going to build anything today. Just take a kind of a tour of the IDE, if you will. So you can see the Xojo workspace window, as we call it. Toolbar at the top with some commonly used items. navigator on the left. On the right, currently it's showing the library. The inspector can be shown by using the buttons here. And the center area essentially is what it is you're working on. So it'll show what you have selected in the navigator. So by default, your desktop projects just come with an app class, a default window, and a default menu bar. And then you can go from there and add what you want. The insert button here gives you access to the project items that you can add to your desktop project. And you can see here, they're just grouped in alphabetical order. So class and class interface, I mentioned before, these are common building components and are used in all project types. And container control is a desktop specific one. I'll skip over database. File type set, also desktop specific. And then folder and image are common. Menu bar is for desktop projects. Module is common. And then these last three here, report, toolbar, and window, are desktop specific. And you can just add any of these by just clicking on it, and it gets added to your navigator, and it will automatically be selected. And as you move around, you can select things that you want to work on. I'll show you a little bit about organization and editing of things, but for now I want to just move along to some of the settings that I talked about. So if you click here on app and you have the inspector displayed, which we do, you can see some of the settings right here in the appearance area. And the default window can be changed to any window that's in your project, or you can even set it to none and have code probably in the app's open event or somewhere open a window, based on what you want. And then also the menu bar. Here is what the default menu bar is going to be. Typically, apps often just stick with a single menu bar. You can have multiple menu bars in your app and switch them by window, but that's not really a common thing people do. So it is supported, but not common. And then the icon here, perhaps it's not obvious, but you can actually click on this little icon here, and that opens the icon editor. Well, it's not really an editor. It's lets you edit the icons that are in the app, but you can't edit the icons specifically. But what you can do here is drag in icons. So if you have a folder of some app icons, you can drag them into their appropriate slots. And you can see there's quite a few different slots, from 1024 by 1024 all the way down to 16 by 16. And you can just drag in the ones you want. And actually, what I did there is if I drop it on some of the gray space in between one of the pictures, it will fill in the lower ones. And so then now your app will have an icon, which is always good when you're building an app to have an icon. Finding icon sources, of course, can be a little tricky. And it's always funny to see these icon sizes that are 1024 by 1024, because that is just so big. That is larger than the size of the original iPhone screen, the original Macintosh screen, and that's just a single icon. But Apple likes these things to be super high quality, and they want lots of sizes in here when you submit to the App Store. And the reason there are lots of different sizes is for different requirements like that. So Apple has their requirements for the Mac App Store. And you can see, when you look at apps in the Finder, there's different sizes of icons. Here, I have column view in my Finder, so it's showing smaller icon sizes. But if I were running in icon view, there would be bigger icon sizes that are showing. And Windows and Linux also have different ways to display files, and they'll use the appropriate icon size to best present it to the user. So that's why they are all in there. All right, the other settings are down here at the bottom in the build settings area. So the navigator has the project contents here at the top, and then the build settings here at the bottom. And the shared build settings has a variety, kind of a smattering of different things. So you get all the version stuff that's up here at the top, the major, minor, and bug version. And you can just put values in here that you want. You can set the stage code A lot of this is useful information, you show on your about window or something like that. This can be like a build number, and you can have it set to automatically increment it each time you do an actual build if you wanted. And you can also fill in textual descriptions here. And these show on various operating systems when you do, you show properties or info for the app itself. The build section has a few other settings here. Build folders, almost always you're going to want this to be on, particularly on Windows. It's, your app gets built into its own folder rather than just kind of thrown in to alongside the project, which, if you got a big project, it might be harder to spot it. So putting it in its own folder is nice. You can tell Xojo when it builds to include function names. This can aid the operating system in dealing with any system crashes or anything like that, as it might be able to yank out some more useful debugging information. The language, if you're building an app that is localized, you can set what the default language is, and it's often good to change this to your specific language. So in my case, I probably would really want this to be English. Optimization level. The default is probably the one that you're going to want to just stick with. It allows for faster build times and is reasonably fast for most types of applications. But there are two other choices available to you if you need them. There's moderate and aggressive. And they just ramp up the optimizing part of the compiler to, attempt to make your code run faster. But they're really geared towards mathematical type stuff. So, if your project has a ton of string manipulations or other things, you might get an improvement, but it probably won't be too dramatic. But as you crank up the optimization level, the build times do take longer. So you have to, decide what works best for you. If you don't build super often, maybe, while you're building, beta builds, you build them in the default setting. And when you get close to the release, maybe you just want to turn on the aggressive setting and do a couple quick tests of that, and then ship it that way just to make sure you get the best performance that your Xojo app can give you. It's up to you, but you got some choices there to work with, which is nice. Supports high DPI. That is for high dots per inch screens. So that defaults to on, and that just means that your Xojo apps will, by default, look super sharp on a high DPI screen, such as an Apple Retina display that I believe at this point, almost all their machines that they ship have Retina displays, except maybe the old MacBook Air. And then high DPI is also supported on Windows and Linux. Not quite as common there, but it is supported, and you can just ramp up the screen resolutions on those. High DPI is great. Everything is nice and sharp. Very good for people like me whose eyes are getting older and more tired and want something that's a little easier to see. Supports dark mode is a new switch that was just added in 2018 release 3, which came out a few weeks ago. And this is a new feature of macOS Mojave that allows you to switch the system at a system level, the entire system, into what's called dark mode. And this kind of doesn't really do a color flip, but it makes everything a lot darker, less harsh, bright whites. A lot of people seem to like it. It can be a lot easier on the eyes. Personally, I find dark mode to not quite have enough contrast for me, so I don't love it. I am testing it out on my laptop to see if I can get used to it, but so far I haven't been too thrilled with dark mode. But Xojo now supports it so that your apps will look proper when they're run on macOS Mojave systems that have dark mode enabled. And a few other not very commonly used debug settings here for command line arguments and the destination location. Primarily that's if you're working with console apps, so not super useful with desktop apps, but they're kind of just here alongside everything else. Each of the operating system targets has their own settings as well. So the macOS setting Gives you, of course, the app name. So your app is obviously going to need a name. You're going to put it in here. You can also specify, if you had file types in your project, they would show up here, and you can give them a role as to whether your app is an owner of them or just uses them or things like that. And then also the build section here, where you can specify whether your app is building as 32-bit or 64-bit. 64-bit is the default on Mac. However, it is important to note that if you are running Xojo on Windows or Linux, you cannot build 64-bit Mac apps from there. You can only build 32-bit Mac apps from Windows or Linux at this time. There's still a restriction with the linker on those platforms that prevents 64-bit Mac building. But you can switch it between here. And all Mac apps need a bundle identifier to be specified. And typically, this is just done in some sort of reverse domain type thing. And it doesn't have to be anything specific, but if you go with your domain name, that's one way that it can be unique, because if you own your domain name, it's not likely anyone else is going to use it. But that's the typical format, is the reverse domain name. So the last part would essentially, doesn't have to, but typically matches the app name. On the Windows side, there, of course, is the Windows app name, and then a few other settings here that can be filled in. These are just text, and they show in the properties for the app if you look at it in Windows Explorer. There's also a couple things here that mention MDI. If you may remember a long time ago, I'm thinking like the 90s, and maybe like the Windows 3 era, maybe into Windows 95. Windows apps would run with a giant window that would have a bunch of smaller windows kind of embedded within the giant window. And that was MDI, or Multiple Document Interface. And it's still supported in Windows. It's just that no one really uses it. So although you can build MDI apps with Xojo, your customers probably aren't going to enjoy using them. So in most cases, we recommend that people probably avoid that app style. And then, of course, you can build your app for Windows as well as 32-bit or 64-bit. And I got a question here from Lance asking if we're planning on changing the default environment on Windows to 64-bit. I was under the impression we have already done that. So I guess I will need to check, but I believe the default environment for Windows is 64-bit. Certainly the Xojo IDE itself does only run on 64-bit versions of Windows. Don't exactly remember when we made that change. I think it might have been earlier this year. And I got another question from Edwin. Oh, actually, it's more of a comment from Edwin rather than a question, noting an app called Night Owl that makes it easy to switch between light and dark modes on Mojave. And that can be very useful for testing. And I imagine it can be, because otherwise you got to go to System Preferences. And I think it's in the General section and tap something, and that may not be quick enough for just quick testing purposes. Linux doesn't have nearly as many things to worry about here, just the app name and the build. And there are three options on Linux for the build. You've got, of course, 32-bit and 64-bit, like Mac and Windows. But there's also a third one, ARM 32-bit. And this essentially means Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi uses an ARM CPU. And as I mentioned, the operating system is still 32-bit. So you need to build a 32-bit app for Raspberry Pi. So you would just switch it to this. And to make it easier to check your box for when you're building, there's a section here at the bottom called This Computer. And this always just refers to the operating system that you're using currently. So right now I'm running on Mac OS. So when I click on this computer, it's showing me the settings here that match Mac OS. If I were on Windows and I clicked on this computer, the Windows settings would show. And this allows me to just have this single item here checked. So if I open this project on Mac and hit build, it'll build me the Mac version. But I've opened it on Windows and click build, it'll build the Windows version. If I wanted to build multiple versions, I can just check all the boxes or whatever you need. And this is just for building. You know, when you click the build button here, when you're running, of course, it's going to run on the operating system that you're using. So that doesn't matter. And if you're remote debugging, you'll tell it which computer to build to, and it'll build for that automatically and send it over. And Alberto is reminding me that the 64-bit version of the Windows IDE started with 2017 R3. So about a year ago or so, I'd say. Thank you, Alberto. All right, so that's the high level of all the settings and other things that are available in your project. I wanted to point out a couple of items here back on the project items that you can add. Folders are a great way to organize things. They don't change how you access anything in the project as far as, you know, using it in your code or anything like that, but it does allow you to just clean up this navigator list. You know, if you have bigger projects, things can get lengthy and hard to find. So maybe you want to consolidate all your windows in one area. You can make a folder called UI, put all that stuff in there. Maybe you want to group things by functionality. So you have a bunch of order related stuff. You call this, all right, this is the folder where I'm putting all my stuff related to orders. This other folder is where I'm going to put all my stuff related to contacts. Who knows, however your project is designed. But you've got some flexibility there. You can, of course, nest folders and do that. I'm going to pull this module out here. And you can see I can just drag stuff around as I want, and it kind of shows me where it's going to stick it. A module is kind of a global thing where you can add stuff to it, methods, properties, whatnot, and you can make them accessible from everywhere in your application. Of course, global properties and things like that do have their risks, so people tend to often work with classes, but sometimes you do want something that is global in some way, so putting that in a module can be neat. But another thing you can do with a module is actually add some stuff to it, in particular classes. So here I've put a class in a module. And when you do this, the module essentially changes its behavior to be something called a namespace. Now you can still, of course, put your own things on the module. So here I can have, you know, methods or properties that are however I want. In these cases, these are set as global. Could set it to protected. I also have a class in here, and this just means that the class can be accessed by including the prefix of the module name. So instead of just referring to this as class 1 in my project, I would refer to this as module1.class1. And that can be another great way to organize things so that your naming doesn't always have to be 100% unique. If I did this, I can still have another class up here in the project that is, if I wanted, not that I'm advocating this necessarily, but it can be handy when you're sharing code. You don't have to worry about name conflicts. I have two classes that look like they both have the name class 1, but this is the one that's really class 1, and you'd refer to as class 1 throughout your project. This one is actual module1.class1. So you get more distinct names, a little better organization, and something some people like using. So keep that in mind with modules. And I want to point out images. Within the last couple of years, we added this feature called image sets. This is part of the support for high DPI displays. And the way this works is you provide multiple sizes of an image in your app. And then when it runs on a high DPI display, the one that better fits the display will be used. So for example, if you were only providing 1x size images in your app and you ran on a high DPI display, those images would have to be scaled up. They probably get a little fuzzy. But if you provide 1x and 2x, then if your app runs on a standard screen, it'll just use the 1x display or image, which is nice. It's probably smaller, load a little faster, takes up less space. But on a high DPI display, it can use the 2x. And there's also a 3x size because high DPI displays vary in how many pixels they have compared to 1x. A lot of Apple displays are strictly 2x, but that's not 100% true anymore. And Windows is all over the map. So you can provide both and let the operating system kind of ask. And Xojo can provide what it has for a good fit. And to use this, you can just drag your images into the appropriate slots. So you can see I've got my sizes here, and I think actually, yeah, I did. I grabbed that size at when I set up my stuff. Yeah, 128 is not 32 times 3, so my apologies. But you can see here it scaled the image down to 96 by 96 for use in the app. So what I should have done is actually either pre-scaled it or grabbed an actual image that was the right size. But you can put your multiple images in here, and you don't have to fill them all in. You can certainly leave out one. A lot of people really just go with 1x and 2x and kind of go that way. It can be a pain to make a lot of different images, and of course that does bloat your app size to have a lot more images included with it. And of course, as more pixels are in the image, the larger the image files are. And the other thing I wanted to show here is, as we're looking at stuff right now, everything is here in the navigator, and as I'm clicking on things, we're moving between stuff, which is neat. But I can also right-click on something and hit Open in New Tab. And you can have any number of tabs. But this can start to be a great way to make it a little easier for you to work on your stuff, particularly as projects get bigger. You can have tabs open pretty much anything. So if you use it commonly, just throw it in its own tab. That might be a lot easier for you to find quickly off the top here than if you have, 50 or 100 things down here, and each time you want to come over here, you got to kind of eyeball the list and find the one you want and click on it. So instead, you can keep the commonly used ones you're working on, right, open up in tabs, and just jump to them with a quick click. All right, I think that's probably really the high-level overview of the desktop stuff that's in Xojo that I wanted to cover today. Not really getting into specifics of how to make desktop apps. I have plenty of other videos on that, and I'll include some of those in the show notes. And Lance is pointing out that on 2018 R3, starting a Windows app, it defaulted to 32-bit. I'll have to check that. I was under the impression that was not the case. But I don't have a Windows VM running at the moment, Lance, so I can't verify it right this second, but I'll check it after the webinar. Let's switch back. I want to point people out to resources that you can take advantage of. You can, of course, download Xojo. The latest version is always available at xojo.com/download. And I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/GoXojo. You'll get notified when new videos are posted, including the recordings of these live videos. Our free book, Introduction to Programming with Xojo, is available at xojo.com/learn. And our user community at forum.xojo.com is a great place to search for answers or ask questions, or if you're so inclined, help out others by answering questions. And a few links, docs.xojo.com as all the language reference, and soon more and more content over the coming months. So definitely check things out there. You can also go to docs.xojo.com, check out the desktop category to see every page and topic in there that is related to making desktop apps with Xojo. And the user guide, which is still at developer.xojo.com, but will move in the coming months, has a section on desktop apps and on desktop app deployment that you can check out. And I mentioned it earlier, 2018 Release 3 came out a few weeks ago, end of October, I guess, maybe just a couple of weeks ago. Had over 120 changes and improvements, including Mojave Dark Mode, which I mentioned. Windows is now a bit faster and is now using the native label control and better text drawing. For 64-bit and ARM builds, there is now incremental compilation available to allow that to happen even faster. And iOS projects now support the latest versions of Xcode and iOS. And we updated SQLite, something we're often doing just about every release. SQLite is updated quite frequently, and I like to stay on top of that. Yeah, actually, a side note, in fact, SQLite just added a big new feature to, I believe it was the 3.25 version, that allows you to alter a table and change a column name, which is, if you've used other larger databases such as Postgres or MySQL, you're like, well, of course, but SQLite never had that feature, so you had to use workarounds, but apparently now it's going to be available. And the new documentation wiki, which is docs.xojo.com, as I mentioned before, is now live and continuing to get new content. All right. You can always reach me via email, paul@xojo.com. And of course on Twitter, @Lefevre or @Xojo. All right. Well, I think that about wraps everything up for today. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.